When people talk about tension between the United States and China, they often describe it in the language of trade. They talk about tariffs, trade deficits, market access, currency pressure, and export control, as if the core dispute were mainly about unfair competition, industrial policy, or who sells more goods to whom. In this reading, the conflict looks large, but still familiar. It resembles an argument between two major economic powers over rules, pricing, subsidies, and strategic advantage in global commerce. That framing is not entirely wrong. Trade is part of the story, but it is not the deepest part. It is the visible surface of a much larger structural anxiety. The real American concern goes far beyond trade because what is rising in China is not just an export machine. What is rising is a rival center of industrial power, technological capability, state coordination, market scale, supply chain depth, infrastructure capacity, and long-term strategic resilience. That is a very different kind of challenge. A trade dispute can be negotiated, tariffs can be raised or lowered, currency pressure can be managed. Even a serious trade imbalance can, in theory, be reduced over time through bargaining, relocation, or policy adjustment. But a rival civilization scale economy that can produce, innovate, scale, finance, and organize across multiple sectors at once is not something that can be solved by a better trade deal. It changes the strategic landscape itself. That is why the relationship feels so much heavier than a normal economic quarrel. If the United States believed China was merely taking advantage of trade loopholes while remaining structurally dependent, then the problem would still be manageable within the older American view of the world. But that is no longer the case. China is not simply participating in the system built under American dominance. It is increasingly developing the capacity to operate with greater autonomy inside that system, to shape parts of it, and in some areas to build parallel capabilities that reduce dependence on American-controlled choke points. This is where anxiety deepens. The issue is not just that China sells a great deal. It is that China has grown large enough, sophisticated enough, and systemically important enough to alter the balance of power underneath global trade itself. That is the hidden logic behind American pressure. Trade language remains useful because it is politically accessible. It allows leaders to speak in terms voters understand: jobs, factories, deficits, prices, and competitiveness. But beneath those words lies a broader strategic fear. Washington is not only asking whether China has benefited too much from globalization, it is also asking whether globalization has helped create the first rival in generations, with the scale to contest American primacy across industry, technology, logistics, finance, military supply, and world influence at the same time.
Behind every great power stands an invisible machine of energy, steel, and movement.
That is why America's real fear of China goes far beyond trade. The first reason America's fear runs deeper than trade is that China represents a challenge to the material foundations of power. Great powers do not rest on consumption alone. They rest on production, energy, infrastructure, industrial ecosystems, logistical capacity, engineering competence, and the ability to mobilize all of those things in a crisis. For many years, the United States was comfortable living in a world where it remained dominant in finance, high-end technology, military power, and global rule setting, even as parts of manufacturing shifted abroad. That arrangement seemed sustainable because America still sat at the top of the system. It controlled the reserve currency, led the alliance network, dominated the oceans, attracted global capital, and held decisive advantages in innovation and advanced military integration. In that world, offshoring looked like an efficiency choice, not a strategic vulnerability. China changed that equation. China did not simply become a cheap labor platform producing low-margin goods for foreign brands. It climbed on. It built industrial clusters of extraordinary density. It developed full-spectrum manufacturing capabilities across steel, cement, electronics, machinery, shipbuilding, chemicals, batteries, solar equipment, telecommunications hardware, rail systems, vehicles, and increasingly more advanced sectors. It also built ports, roads, logistics systems, power grids, industrial zones, and training pipelines on a scale that gave those sectors staying power. Over time, this created something much more significant than export success. It created the material base of national strength. A country that can manufacture at scale is not just making products. It is building strategic options. This matters because the United States understands, at least at the serious strategic level, that power ultimately needs a physical base. Financial dominance is immense, but ships are still made of steel. Military platforms still rely on machine tools. Components, chips, metals, fuel systems, precision manufacturing, and industrial subcontracting chains. Energy transition still requires rare earth processing, battery production, grid equipment, and large-scale engineering. Technological competition still depends on fabs, materials, equipment, talent formation, and supply chain control. In all of these areas, America's concern is not merely that China has become competitive. It is that China has achieved a level of scale where its industrial presence can no longer be treated as a secondary feature of the global economy. It is becoming one of the organizing facts of the 21st century. This is the first lesson.
Power is not what a nation claims. Power is what its system can keep alive.
America's deeper fear is not that China exports too much. It is that China is building the kind of industrial depth that historically underwrites long-term geopolitical strength. Trade deficits are symptoms that politicians can campaign against. Industrial displacement, supply dependence, and the hollowing out of manufacturing ecosystems are more profound problems. They raise a harder question. If one country increasingly finances, design, consumes, and projects power, while another country increasingly makes, assembles, scales, and supplies the physical systems that hold the modern world together, which one is better positioned for prolonged strategic competition? That question is far more unsettling than any tariff dispute. The second reason America's real fear goes beyond trade is that China is not only accumulating economic weight, it is accumulating systemic leverage. A country becomes truly difficult to contain when it is no longer just a participant in global markets, but a keynote in the systems other countries rely on. China has moved in that direction across multiple layers at once. It plays a central role in manufacturing supply chains, intermediate goods, strategic minerals processing, maritime commerce, industrial components, consumer electronics assembly, renewable energy equipment, and an expanding range of technology-linked industries. This does not mean China controls everything. It means that decoupling from China is no longer a simple act of policy. It is a costly and disruptive restructuring of the global economic organism. That changes the nature of American fear. If China were merely a large exporter of finished goods, the United States could respond through tariffs, targeted industrial incentives, or selective import substitution. But China is often embedded much deeper than that. It appears in upstream inputs, processing stages, assembly networks, shipping flows, commercial infrastructure, and industrial ecosystems that span continents. In other words, the challenge is not only bilateral. It is systemic. American planners have to think not just about the U.S. China trade balance, but about what happens if China's role in the global system allows it to generate influence, even where American political power remains strong. This is where strategic concern becomes more than economic irritation. It becomes fear of dependence, exposure, and loss of course of advantage. There is also a second layer to this systemic anxiety: time. The United States has spent decades occupying the commanding heights of globalization. It shaped institutions, standards, finance, maritime protection, technology ecosystem, and alliance structures. But China's rise suggests that a state can become central to the world economy, not by inheriting the existing order exactly as it is, but by mastering enough of its productive core to make itself indispensable within it. That creates a particularly difficult problem for Washington. America is not simply confronting a rival outside the system. It is confronting a rival that grew powerful inside the system, benefited from its openness, and now possesses enough scale to reduce the effectiveness of traditional pressure mechanisms. This is especially visible in the area of strategic competition. Export controls, sanctions, investment restrictions, technology blockades, and industrial policy are all signs that the American response has moved well beyond the language of free trade. These are not the tools of a government merely correcting commercial unfairness. They are the tools of a state trying to slow the rise of a strategic competitor before relative advantage erodes too far. The concern is no longer only that Chinese goods are cheap or abundant. It is that Chinese capabilities may become too broad, too integrated, and too resilient to be reversed once they cross certain thresholds in advanced manufacturing. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, green industry, aerospace, telecommunication, and dual-use technologies. This is the second lesson. America fears China at a deeper level because China is becoming harder to isolate, harder to pressure, and harder to outscale in key industrial domains. Trade can be renegotiated. Systemic leverage is much more dangerous. Once another power becomes embedded in the arteries of global production and begins converting scale into independence, the issue is no longer who wins more exports this year. The issue is who will shape the material architecture of world power over the coming decades. That is a much larger contest. The third and deepest reason America's fear goes beyond trade is that China forces the United States to confront the possibility of historical transition. For decades after the Cold War, the United States operated in an environment where no rival could combine population scale, industrial capacity, technological ambition, state continuity, civilizational identity, and strategic patience in the way China now does. Other challengers existed, but none presented quite the same type of long-horizon pressure. China is not just another difficult state. It is large enough to matter in every category that shapes power. It has the population base to support a huge internal market, the industrial base to produce at scale, the political continuity to pursue long-term objectives, the civilizational confidence to resist ideological absorption, and the strategic seriousness to think in generational terms. That makes it psychologically and structurally different from a normal competitor.
We are not just following events. We are tracing the forces that move them.